Throughout history, we've witnessed pandemics that have swept through entire civilizations, altering the course of nations, empires, and cultures. But what happens when these pandemics aren't just a minor setback, but the very force that unravels the foundations of once great civilizations? In this video, we'll explore 10 terrifying pandemics that devastated ancient civilizations, leaving behind only questions, ruins, and mystery. First up, we'll dive into one of the deadliest pandemics in history, the Black Death. Top 1. The Black Death. In October 1347, 12 merchant ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina, carrying a cargo of goods, but the crew aboard was not so fortunate. Most were already dead, and the few who survived were delirious, covered in black, swollen boils and oozing pus and blood. The Black Death had arrived, a plague that would go on to wipe out a third of Europe's population. Within a year, it reached France, Spain, and the British Isles, moving with terrifying speed across the continent. The disease, which spread like wildfire through the densely populated cities of Europe, left death in its wake. Whole families were found lifeless in their homes, while entire communities were devastated. In cities like London, carts were sent through the streets to collect the dead, who were piled high in mass graves. The stench of death filled the air, and it was said that in some places, the dead outnumbered the living. What made this pandemic so terrifying was not only its speed, but its mysterious nature. Victims developed fever, chills, and painful buboes, lumps in the armpits, neck, and groin. Many died within days, gasping for air and bleeding internally. Some even exhibited strange neurological symptoms, lashing out or babbling before collapsing. Physicians had no real understanding of the disease, and remedies ranged from bloodletting to inhaling crushed emeralds. Nothing seemed to work. Historians and scientists widely believe the cause was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that infested black rats. But this explanation has been questioned, as the disease spread far faster than typical bubonic plague, reaching areas with no known rat populations. In some regions, people died within 24 hours of showing symptoms, which suggests that the Black Death could have been a much more aggressive strain, potentially airborne or even hemorrhagic. The Black Death didn't just affect Europe's population, it had deep societal, cultural, and economic impacts. Feudal economies crumbled as laborers died in the fields, and entire social classes were decimated. The Catholic Church lost its authority in the eyes of many, as clergy perished in droves and were unable to provide the spiritual solace they once did. Panic and superstition spread quickly, with some blaming Jews, others blaming the stars. Perhaps one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the Black Death is why it vanished as quickly as it came. By the 1350s, it had largely disappeared from Europe, only to reappear sporadically in later centuries with diminished intensity. Was it a mutation in the bacteria that eventually burned itself out, or was there a more complex set of factors at play? Climate change, war, and trade? And why did it have such a devastating impact on human history? Top 2. The American Great Dying. In 1519, Spanish ships led by Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of what is now Mexico. With fewer than 1,000 men, they ventured into the heart of the Aztec Empire, an empire of millions, complete with massive stone cities, sophisticated agriculture, and complex social systems. But within just a few years, it wasn't warfare or weapons that collapsed this mighty empire. It was something far more insidious, an invisible force, one that swept through an entire continent. Disease. What followed would become known as the Great Dying, the most catastrophic depopulation event in recorded history. By some estimates, over 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished between the early 1500s and the early 1600s. Entire civilizations vanished. In less than a century, regions once densely populated with cities, road networks, and farmland became silent forests again. Eyewitness accounts from the era describe the horrifying impact of the disease. In villages, half the population was dead, with corpses lying unburied, scavenged by animals. Spanish friars, often the only literate observers in remote regions, chronicled the horror: sudden fevers, bleeding from the nose and ears, vomiting black bile. In many cases, the disease seemed to kill within days of the first symptoms. It did not spare anyone, chiefs, priests, children, and warriors alike. Smallpox is often cited as the primary culprit behind the Great Dying, introduced by Europeans. It undeniably ravaged central Mexico and the Caribbean. But not all outbreaks followed the same symptoms. Some waves of illness, like the infamous Coca-Listi epidemics of 1545 and 1576, caused sudden death with extreme dehydration, internal bleeding, and neurological symptoms. The indigenous Nahuatl word cocoy referred to pestilence or great sickness, yet the exact pathogen remains unidentified. Modern research using ancient DNA has failed to isolate a known virus or bacterium responsible for these specific epidemics. Some scientists suggest the possibility of a hemorrhagic fever native to the Americas. Others believe it may have been exacerbated by climate shifts and drought conditions that created the ideal environment for viral mutations. Beyond the physical devastation, the cultural consequences were immeasurable. Entire oral traditions were lost as entire lineages were wiped out. Monumental architecture, once thriving, was left abandoned. Temples fell silent and languages ceased to be spoken. To outsiders, this disappearance was a mystery. To survivors, it was an apocalypse. The speed and scale of the die-off were so complete that it reshaped the Earth's atmosphere. Studies suggest that the depopulation of the Americas contributed to a measurable drop in global carbon dioxide levels. With fewer people to farm and burn forests, vegetation reclaimed massive areas. This rewilding may have even contributed to the global cooling trend known as the Little Ice Age. The Great Dying remains a biological enigma. While many speculate that it originated with European contact, there are hints that native pathogens may have been present long before, dormant until the environmental and social stress brought them to the surface. Despite centuries of study, no single explanation fully accounts for the vast and varied symptoms or the near-total collapse of indigenous populations. The Great Dying was not merely a biological event, it was a force that reshaped the Americas, wiping out entire civilizations and cultures in its wake. And despite the records left behind by Spanish missionaries, it remains one of the most devastating yet underexplored pandemics in history. In top 3, the English sweating sickness. In the summer of 1485, as England stood on the brink of dynastic war, a more immediate threat silently infiltrated its cities. It began in the southern port of Dorset, spreading rapidly inland. Victims would feel a sudden chill followed by intense sweating, panic, chest pain, and an overwhelming urge to lie down. Within hours, many were dead. This was the sweating sickness, an illness so sudden and violent that healthy men at breakfast were dead by supper. The disease struck 5 times between 1485 and 1551, each outbreak terrifying the population more than the last. Unlike the plague, which lingered for weeks, the sweating sickness often wiped out entire communities in days. Nobles, scholars, and even royalty were not spared. In 1502, Prince Arthur, the eldest son of Henry VIII, died suddenly, suspected by many to have been from the sweating sickness. In 1528, the disease spread as far as Hamburg and northern Europe, but curiously, it never touched southern France, Italy, or the Mediterranean. Its symptoms were bizarre and uniquely English. Reports described an overwhelming sense of dread, cold shivers, dizziness, intense thirst, and chest tightness. Then came the profuse sweating so intense that sheets and clothing were drenched in minutes. Victims often collapsed from exhaustion, and many died within 3 to 6 hours. Unlike plague or smallpox, there were no visible sores, rashes, boils, or buboes, just an internal collapse. Historians have proposed various theories for the disease's cause, including anthrax, hantavirus, ergot poisoning, and influenza variants. Some researchers have even linked it to a now extinct strain of the HIV virus, possibly spread by rodents during the upheaval of the War of the Roses. Others have suggested a tick-borne illness or a disease related to modern-day Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. Yet there is no surviving genetic material to test, no samples to analyze, just written records and fear. What is most mysterious about the sweating sickness is how it suddenly vanished. After the last major outbreak in 1551, the disease disappeared completely. No region on Earth has seen another outbreak of exactly the same symptoms. For a disease so deadly and widespread, Its total extinction without explanation is as strange as its rapid arrival. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the sweating sickness is how few people outside of England remember it today. There are no monuments to its victims, no preserved towns or public rituals. Only scattered letters, burial records, and first-hand accounts remain. For a disease that could kill in a matter of hours, one might expect a more lasting mark on human history. Instead, it came, killed, and disappeared, leaving behind a gap in medical knowledge that has never been closed. The sweating sickness remains one of the only major epidemics in human history with no confirmed cause, no surviving pathogen, and no clear origin. It remains a phantom, recorded, feared, and never seen again. Top 4. The Cyprian Plague. In the year 250 CE, as the Roman Empire struggled with political instability and border invasions, an even more devastating enemy emerged, one that ignored legions, fortresses, and walls. It began, according to early sources, in the region of Ethiopia. Within weeks, the disease swept through Egypt, then into North Africa, and across the Mediterranean, ravaging Carthage, Rome, and far beyond. It was so relentless, so consuming, that even hardened Roman soldiers feared the heavens had turned against them. History remembers it as the Cyprian Plague. The name comes from Saint Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, who chronicled the disease in stark, almost apocalyptic terms. His descriptions, intended as a theological warning, have become vital clues for modern scholars. According to Cyprian, victims experienced severe diarrhea, continuous vomiting, loss of hearing, partial blindness, fever, and gangrenous limbs. The intestines are shaken with continual vomiting, he wrote. The eyes are on fire with the infected blood, and in some cases, the feet or other limbs are taken off by the contagion. These symptoms made the plague particularly horrifying, as it not only caused extreme physical suffering, but also left victims with severe neurological damage. What made the Cyprian plague particularly horrifying was not just its symptoms, but its scale. At its peak, it reportedly killed up to 5,000 people per day in Rome alone. In an empire already fraying from internal conflict, civil war, and economic collapse, the plague amplified every weakness. Fields were left untended, towns abandoned, and armies diminished. The Emperor Decius, who died in 251 CE, was among many who succumbed during this time, possibly a direct victim of the disease. The religious response was just as transformative. Pagan Romans interpreted the plague as punishment from the gods for neglecting old rites. Meanwhile, Christian communities who tended to the sick, regardless of belief, gained credibility, converts, and influence. Some historians argue that the Cyprian plague was a pivotal moment in the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Faith replaced fear. In many places, altars were destroyed, and churches were built where temples once stood. Yet the pathogen behind this ancient terror remains unknown. Was it smallpox, a hemorrhagic virus, or perhaps even a form of viral encephalitis? The symptoms described, especially the bleeding eyes and progressive limb necrosis, have few direct analogs in modern diseases. Some scholars have speculated that it might have been a highly virulent strain of Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever, but no definitive evidence has been found. The legacy of the Cyprian plague is not just in its biological impact, but in its psychological and cultural consequences. The plague of Cyprian reshaped the Roman Empire, shaking its religious foundations, toppling emperors, and leaving a trail of social upheaval. But its true origins and the reasons for its virulence remain a mystery. Some believe it was the perfect storm, climate changes, food shortages, and the movement of armies and people, creating the ideal conditions for a pandemic to sweep through the empire. But what remains undeniable is the way this plague shaped the course of history as it accelerated the rise of Christianity and led to the eventual transformation of the Roman world. Top 5. The Cocalisti epidemics. In the high valleys of New Spain, now known as Mexico, an invisible enemy began to spread through indigenous populations in the mid-1500s. Entire villages fell silent, their inhabitants struck by a mysterious illness that left them dead within days of the first symptoms. The locals called it Cocalisti, a Nahuatl word meaning great pestilence. The first major wave of this unknown illness, in the mid-1540s, killed between 5 and 15 million people, decimating nearly 80% of the remaining native population. Then in 1576, it struck again, claiming millions more lives. What made the Coca-Listi epidemic so terrifying was not just the scale of death, but the symptoms. Eyewitness accounts from Spanish missionaries and physicians painted a haunting picture of the disease. Victims developed high fevers, severe headaches, chest and abdominal pain, and intense thirst. Within hours, they began bleeding from their eyes, nose, and mouth. In many cases, the skin turned yellow and the tongue turned black. Death often came within 3 to 4 days of the first symptoms, and the affliction seemed to strike with such intensity that it wiped out entire communities in a matter of days. Unlike European diseases such as smallpox or measles, which had known symptoms and relatively predictable outcomes, the Coca-Listi epidemic appeared to be uniquely devastating to the indigenous population. Spanish settlers living in close proximity to the affected areas were largely unharmed, which further fueled the idea that the disease was somehow specific to the native peoples. Modern researchers have attempted to identify the pathogen behind Coca-Listi by analyzing skeletal remains from known burial sites, but the results have been inconclusive. One study published in 2018 suggested the presence of Salmonella enterica, a bacterium associated with typhoid fever, but the symptoms described in 16th century reports do not match modern typhoid. Other theories propose that it was a hemorrhagic fever, possibly a virus native to the Americas that has since gone extinct. Some scientists speculate that the disease may have been a previously unrecorded zoonotic illness, passed from wild animals to humans under extreme environmental stress. The prolonged megadroughts of the 16th century, combined with the disruption of traditional food and water systems due to colonial occupation, may have weakened immune systems and created ideal conditions for the pathogen to thrive. The physical remains of Coca-Listi are scarce. Burials were rushed and mass graves were dug without ceremony. At sites like Tipascolula, Yucunda, a Mixtec site in Oaxaca, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of skeletons piled into a single churchyard, all dated to the outbreak period. The lack of signs of trauma or warfare suggests that the deaths were purely from disease, and no records exist detailing the cultural or political consequences of such devastation. What is perhaps most unsettling is that after the 16th century, Coca-Listi simply disappeared. No major outbreaks were recorded in the Levant or the Americas for hundreds of years. The disease burned bright and fast, then retreated into the shadows. This sudden disappearance without explanation is as strange as its rapid emergence. And the legacy of Coca-Listi is even more profound. It played a major role in the collapse of indigenous societies in the Americas, with entire generations wiped out, and crucial cultural practices, languages, and traditions lost forever. In many ways, Coca-Listi was the true agent of colonization in the Americas, clearing the way for European settlers to expand their control. Top 6. The Plague of Justinian. In 541 CE, the Byzantine Empire, under the rule of Emperor Justinian I, was at the height of its power. The empire stretched from North Africa to the highlands of Armenia, and Constantinople, its capital, gleamed with golden domes and marble forms. However, this prosperity would soon be interrupted by a force unlike any that had come before. It began quietly in the port city of Pelusium, Egypt, and within weeks the disease had spread across the Mediterranean basin, reaching as far as Spain, Italy, and North Africa. It was the Plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. The Plague of Justinian devastated the Eastern Roman Empire, killing as many as 25 to 50 million people. At its peak, the disease claimed up to 10,000 lives per day in Constantinople alone. The symptoms were brutal: high fevers, vomiting, and painful swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes. Victims who survived the fever often succumbed to secondary infections, while others died within days, leaving the city in chaos. The plague had a psychological toll as well, as citizens feared the wrath of the gods and turned to religious rituals in an attempt to appease the divine. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Plague of Justinian was its speed and reach. It spread faster than any previous epidemic, moving through military camps, port cities, and trade hubs, using the very networks that made the Byzantine Empire powerful. Despite its similarities to the later Black Death, the Justinian plague was more persistent, returning in waves for nearly 2 centuries. Each recurrence of the disease weakened the empire further, disrupting trade, agriculture, and military campaigns. The economic and political effects were profound. As the disease ravaged the population, tax revenues dwindled, and the empire's armies were decimated. Justinian's ambitious plans to reconquer the Western Roman Empire faltered as his soldiers and generals fell ill. Famine followed disease as fields went unplowed and crops were left to rot. But the disease's impact wasn't just biological, it reshaped the empire's political landscape. The emperor himself fell ill, though he survived and many of his contemporaries didn't. Modern researchers have theorized that the plague of Justinian may have been exacerbated by environmental factors, including the eruption of a volcano in 536 CE, which caused global cooling. This cooling would have disrupted rodent populations, forcing them to migrate and spreading the fleas that carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. However, some believe that the aggressiveness of the strain and the rapid spread may point to additional factors, possibly a combination of climate change and increased human migration. Despite the devastation, the plague of Justinian didn't mark the end of the Byzantine Empire. It weakened the empire significantly, leaving it more vulnerable to attacks from invaders like the Persians and later the rise of Islam. But in many ways, the empire would never recover to its former strength. The plague not only decimated the population, but also left psychological and social scars that took centuries to heal. The plague of Justinian changed the course of history, weakening one of the greatest empires in the world and forever altering the fabric of Mediterranean society. Top 7. The Antonine Plague. In 165 CE, the Roman Empire was at the peak of its power, stretching across 3 continents and controlling much of the known world. But as Roman legions returned victorious from campaigns in the east, they carried with them not only spoils of war, but something far more lethal: an invisible passenger that would soon engulf the empire. The Antonine Plague, one of the deadliest pandemics in Roman history, began its deadly journey as soldiers from the eastern provinces returned to Italy, unknowingly bringing the pathogen with them. The Antonine Plague, named after the ruling Antonine dynasty, ravaged the empire for nearly 15 years, killing an estimated 5 to 10 million people. The disease's symptoms were brutal: high fever, diarrhea, skin eruptions, and black scabs covering the body. Victims often suffered secondary infections, and many of them died in the course of a few days. Galen, the famous Roman physician, documented the disease, describing its spread and its deadly effects. His accounts provide one of the few records of this mysterious illness, which modern researchers believe was a smallpox outbreak. What set the Antonine Plague apart was its timing and the way it spread so rapidly through Roman military camps, port cities, and trade hubs. As the disease spread from the eastern provinces, it made its way westward, ravaging large populations in places like Rome, Athens, and Alexandria. The army, which had been Rome's backbone, suffered significant losses. Recruitment faltered, and military campaigns were delayed. The economy also began to crumble as the workforce was decimated by the plague, leading to widespread shortages in supplies and food. The psychological impact of the Antonine Plague was immense. As soldiers and civilians alike fell ill, fear spread across the empire. The imperial capital, Rome, saw a massive loss of life, and the empire's infrastructure began to weaken. With many citizens dying in their homes, mass burials became a common sight. This devastating loss of life caused instability, particularly in regions already grappling with civil unrest and external threats from barbarian tribes. The plague's societal impact was equally profound. Pagan religious practices faltered as the gods were seen as powerless to stop the plague. Meanwhile, Christianity, then a growing but marginal religion, began to rise in influence. The Christian response to the plague was one of care and compassion for the sick, regardless of belief, which gained the movement new converts. Some historians believe that this plague played a significant role in the eventual spread of Christianity throughout the empire, as the Christian communities gained a reputation for caring for the sick in ways that the Roman state could not. Although the plague eventually subsided, its effects were felt for generations. The Antonine Plague weakened the Roman Empire, and foreshadowed the more devastating crises to come. The death toll, combined with the loss of military strength and the erosion of social structures, contributed to the eventual decline of the empire. Top 8. The Plague of Athens. In the year 430 BCE, the Peloponnesian War was raging, and Athens was under siege by the Spartans. As the city's population crowded within its walls to escape the advancing enemy, an even greater enemy, one that could not be fought with shields or spears, struck. It began in the port of Piraeus, Athens' main gateway for food and supplies, and within days it spread through the overcrowded city, decimating the population. This was the Plague of Athens, one of the earliest recorded pandemics in history, and its devastating effects would change the course of Greek history. The disease, which killed up to 100,000 people, or about a quarter of Athens' population, struck with horrifying speed. Its symptoms were unlike any disease known at the time. Victims first experienced high fever, red and inflamed eyes, and a sore throat that prevented speech. This was followed by uncontrollable sneezing, coughing, and vomiting. Many suffered violent convulsions, intense thirst, and in later stages, gangrene in the extremities. Some even lost their memory and eyesight. The stench of death filled the air as the city's streets became littered with bodies. The most vivid account of the plague comes from the historian Thucydides, who not only survived the outbreak, but also documented it in his work History of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, who witnessed the effects firsthand, described how the disease spared neither the poor nor the wealthy, claiming the lives of politicians, soldiers, and everyday citizens alike. The overwhelming death toll caused the social fabric of Athens to unravel. With so many dead, traditional religious practices were abandoned, and funeral rites were neglected. The city's moral and social order broke down as people, gripped by fear, turned to lawlessness and despair. Some scholars have speculated that the disease was a form of typhus, brought into the city by the masses of people who sought refuge from the Spartan siege. Others suggest it could have been smallpox or even a hemorrhagic fever. The true identity of the plague remains unclear, as no physical evidence of the disease has survived in modern times. However, DNA analysis of ancient burial sites in Athens may offer some insights into the pathogen's origins. The impact of the Plague of Athens extended beyond its immediate toll. The death of Pericles, the city's leader and one of its greatest military strategists, left Athens vulnerable at a critical moment in the war. The plague also contributed to the eventual defeat of Athens by Sparta, as the city's morale and resources were severely depleted. Athens, once a beacon of democracy and intellectual achievement, was left crippled by this invisible enemy. In a society that valued reason, logic, and philosophy, the plague posed an existential challenge. For many, the sudden and unexplainable nature of the disease was a sign that the gods had forsaken them. This loss of faith in the divine, combined with the destruction of the city's leadership, marked a turning point in Athens' history. The Plague of Athens, unlike any other event in its time, revealed the fragility of even the most powerful and prosperous civilizations. Top 9. The Rashidun Plague of Amwas. In 639 CE, as the early Islamic Rashidun Caliphate was expanding rapidly, a deadly epidemic struck the Levant, particularly affecting the region of Amwas in present-day Palestine. This plague, which claimed the lives of thousands, including many high-ranking officials and companions of the Prophet Muhammad, had a significant impact on the course of Islamic history. It disrupted military campaigns and left a deep scar on the early Islamic State. The Rashidun Plague of Amwas, though often overshadowed by other pandemics in history, left a unique mark on the emerging Islamic world. The earliest Islamic sources describe the plague in detail, noting that it caused intense fever, internal bleeding, and sudden death. One observer wrote that it consumed the soldiers like fire consumes wood. The disease spread rapidly among the Muslim army stationed in the area, wiping out key figures, including Abu Ubaidah Jarrah, one of the Prophet's companions and a prominent general of the Rashidun army. His death marked a turning point, as he was one of the most capable military leaders in the caliphate, and his loss disrupted the leadership structure at a critical time. What makes the Rashidun Plague historically significant is not just its timing, but its political consequences. The Rashidun army, which had recently conquered vast territories from the Byzantine Empire, was forced to halt its advance into Syria and beyond due to the outbreak. The disease struck with such force that Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, fearing the further spread of the plague, reportedly refused to enter the affected region, citing the Prophet's instruction not to enter or flee a land afflicted by plague. This decision, combining religious principle with early public health logic, prevented further exposure, but it also slowed the rapid expansion of the Rashidun Caliphate. The Rashidun Plague of Amwas serves as a pivotal moment in Islamic history. The Caliphate's military elite, who had been essential in its expansion, was decimated by the disease, forcing a reorganization of the army and shifts in leadership. These shifts had ripple effects that shaped the political and military future of the Islamic State. Despite the great loss, the event also had a lasting spiritual impact. In Islamic tradition, those who die from plague are considered martyrs, and the faithful who perished in Amwas were granted a special spiritual status, reinforcing the role of faith during crises. Modern historians believe the plague was most likely a form of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the later Black Death. The symptoms of swelling lymph nodes and rapid death fit the profile of bubonic plague, but other sources suggest the possibility of a different pathogen. Regardless of the exact disease, the impact on the Rashidun Caliphate was profound. The Amwas plague has faded into obscurity outside of academic circles, but its effects on the early Islamic world were immense. It reshaped military leadership, altered the course of territorial expansion, and left an indelible mark on the history of the Islamic Empire. Top 10. The Rashidun Plague of Emmas. In the year 639 CE, just months after the devastating plague of Amwas, another outbreak of disease spread across the Levant, this time centered around the town of Emmas, near Jerusalem. Although it is often confused with the plague of Amwas due to overlapping geography and timeline, many historical sources treat the Emmas outbreak as a separate event with its own unique patterns of devastation and spiritual significance. This second wave of plague would deepen the crisis facing the early Rashidun Caliphate and solidify 639 CE as a year of unparalleled mortality in the early Islamic world. The plague spread rapidly through the ranks of the Muslim army stationed in the region, striking down soldiers, leaders, and civilians alike. Symptoms were similar to those of the previous outbreak: intense fever, swelling in the neck and groin, severe delirium, and sudden death. Soldiers reported feeling feverish and weak, often dying within a single day of falling ill. One observer described how an entire company of soldiers stationed near Emmas was wiped out in less than a week without ever encountering enemy forces. The disease moved like wildfire, sweeping through the population and decimating both the military and the civilian population. What makes the plague of Emmas particularly significant is not just the speed and scale of the disease, but the psychological and political consequences it left in its wake. The Rashidun army, which had already suffered considerable losses in the previous outbreak, was once again thrown into disarray. High-ranking military leaders, already weakened by the earlier wave of plague, were struck down, creating a power vacuum in the region. As the plague claimed the lives of the military elite, a reorganization of leadership became necessary, and new commanders had to be appointed. The plague also caused widespread panic, and the Muslim soldiers who had been fighting to expand the caliphate's territories were forced to halt their campaigns. In some areas, entire villages were abandoned as people fled in fear, unsure whether they could survive the plague's relentless spread. What was once a fast-moving, rapidly expanding military force was now crippled by disease. This delay in military campaigns would have lasting effects on the Rashidun Caliphate's growth. Religious scholars of the time described the plague as a divine trial, interpreting it as a test from Allah. Many believed that those who perished in the plague were martyrs, while others saw it as a form of divine retribution. This view reinforced the resilience of the Islamic faith, as survivors took comfort in the belief that their suffering was part of a greater divine plan. While the plague of Emmas eventually subsided, its effects were profound and long-lasting. Unlike the earlier outbreaks of the Black Death or the Antonine Plague, the Emmas epidemic did not leave behind mass burial sites or clear archaeological evidence of its devastation. What survives today are fragmented accounts from early Islamic sources, noting the high mortality rates, the social upheaval, and the shift in power dynamics within the early Islamic world. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the Rashidun Plague of Emmas remains a critical event in the early history of Islam, illustrating how disease, more than military conquest, can reshape the political and spiritual landscape of an empire. The 10 pandemics we've explored are more than just historical events. They are monumental turning points that reshape the course of human history. These outbreaks didn't just wipe out populations, they altered the fate of entire civilizations. From the Black Death in Europe to the Great Dying in the Americas, and the plagues that decimated the Roman and early Islamic empires, these pandemics were not mere biological events. They were cataclysmic forces that reshaped political, cultural, and religious landscapes. Each pandemic had its own unique impact, but what binds them together is the devastating power they held over humanity, bringing entire empires to their knees. The Black Death crumbled Europe's social order, while the Antonine Plague weakened the Roman Empire to the point of vulnerability. The Coca-Listi epidemics in Mexico wiped out civilizations that had been thriving for centuries, and the Rashidun plagues drastically altered the trajectory of Islamic expansion. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these pandemics is the mystery that surrounds them. Why did some of these diseases vanish so quickly? What were the true causes behind these ancient catastrophes? And why do some remain so poorly understood even today? As modern science continues to unravel the mysteries of ancient diseases, we are reminded that the most destructive forces in history are not always the most obvious. Sometimes they arrive silently, without warning, and leave a trail of devastation that echoes through the centuries. These pandemics show us that the strength of a civilization is not just measured by its military might or its wealth, but by its resilience in the face of forces beyond human control. While we may have made great strides in medicine, the mysteries of these ancient diseases remind us that there is still much we don't know, and that history's most devastating events are often the ones we can least explain. The deadliest forces in history are not always the loudest. Sometimes they arrive quietly with a fever, a cough, a silence. And the question remains, what other pandemics have shaped the course of human civilization, leaving no trace but the echoes of their devastation?